Think back, not for a year, not to a news story, to a feeling, the feeling of a Sunday afternoon with nothing in it, the feeling of leaving the house and being genuinely, completely unreachable for hours, the feeling of finishing work and work being finished. If you grew up before the internet was in your pocket, you know exactly what I mean. And if you're honest with yourself, you haven't felt that way in a long time. Here's what the data shows. In the 1990s, when your life was objectively harder, less money, less job security, no GPS, no Google, no next-day delivery, anxiety disorders in both Britain and America were significantly lower than they are today. Not slightly lower, significantly. And here is what makes that so difficult to accept. We fixed almost everything that should have caused anxiety. We got faster, more comfortable, more connected, more informed, more entertained than any generation in the history of the human race. And yet, measurably, clinically, across every objective indicator researchers track, we became more anxious. This video is going to tell you exactly why, not with opinions, with data, and with something the data alone cannot show you, what it actually felt like to live inside a life that wasn't doing this to you, because you lived it. You remember it. And there are things about that life, specific, measurable, documented things, that most people have never been told. We'll also look at the one specific year where the graph breaks, where a line that had been flat for decades suddenly begins climbing and never stops. Stay with me, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The numbers. Let's start with the numbers, because nostalgia is easy to dismiss. Feelings about the past are easy to wave away. Numbers are harder. In 1990, approximately 4% of the global population met clinical criteria for an anxiety disorder. That figure comes from early World Health Organization tracking of mental health prevalence worldwide. It held relatively steady through the decade. By 2021, anxiety disorders affected an estimated 359 million people globally. In high-income countries like the UK and the United States, the figure was notably higher. In the United States, by 2022, 1 in 5 adults reported experiencing symptoms of anxiety within just the previous 2 weeks. Not over a lifetime, not in their worst year, in the past 14 days, when they were asked. The UK shows the same picture. Now, I want to address the obvious objection immediately. Some people say, we simply talk about mental health more now. People were always anxious. They just didn't say so. That's partially true. Stigma has reduced. Language has improved. But here is why that doesn't hold as the full answer. Researchers don't only count feelings, they count emergency room visits for self-harm, suicide rates, prescription rates for antidepressants, absence from work attributed to mental health. These are not surveys of feelings. These are behaviors, things people did or didn't do that can be counted and verified. And all of those objective behavioral measures rose together, consistently, in the same direction, in both countries, starting around the same time. So, the increase is real. But here is the first thing that most people, including most researchers discussing this publicly, never mention. The anxiety epidemic did not hit every generation equally. It hit one generation with particular force. And the timing of that, which generation and when, turns out to be the most important clue in this entire story. Between 2010 and 2018, rates of major depression in teenagers rose 52%, In young adults aged 18 to 25, the rise was 63% in 8 years. No previous generation in recorded history has shown anything like that trajectory. And those 8 years, 2010 to 2018, overlap almost exactly with the years when smartphone ownership went from uncommon to universal. That is not a coincidence. That is a clue. And it leads us directly to something about daily life in the 1990s that most people have quietly half forgotten. What you've half forgotten? Do you remember what it felt like to be bored? Not frustrated, not overstimulated and understimulated simultaneously, which is what most people mean when they say bored now. Actually bored, sitting somewhere with nothing to do and no way to fill it, waiting for a bus with nothing but your own thoughts, a Sunday afternoon that simply had to be gotten through. That feeling, which most people over 40 remember clearly, turns out to matter far more than anyone understood at the time. But first, here is a number that most people have never seen. In 1995, American teenagers spent an average of 2 hours per day socializing face-to-face with friends. By 2012, that figure had dropped by more than 40%. 2 hours a day, face-to-face, with friends, reduced by nearly half in less than 20 years. We tell ourselves that digital connection replaced physical connection. The data says it didn't. It replaced the time, not the depth. And here is something else that disappeared in those same years that almost nobody talks about. Teenagers in the 1990s drove. This sounds trivial. It is not. Getting your license was a rite of passage. Independence, freedom, the ability to go somewhere without a parent. In 1983, nearly half of all American 16-year-olds had a driver's license. By 2018, that figure had fallen to 25%. They are not driving. They are not meeting friends face-to-face. They are not developing, through the ordinary friction of physical life, the resilience that comes from navigating the real world in real time. They are home, online, comparing. Now think about what it meant, that no one could reach you. You left the house, and that was it. Your boss could not message you at 10 at night. Your colleagues couldn't copy you into an argument started at 8:30 on a Sunday morning. The news waited until you chose to hear it. The world did not follow you. For most of your adult life, you took that for granted. It was not a wellness practice, not a privilege, not a choice. It was simply the default structure of daily life, and it was doing something for your nervous system that you didn't notice, because you only ever notice an absence when it's gone. Your social world in the 1990s was bounded by geography. You compared yourself to the people you actually knew, your neighbors, your colleagues, the people in your street. Those people, by definition, were living roughly similar lives, same town, same general circumstances. If a neighbor got a slightly nicer car, you noticed. Maybe it stung. And then you got on with your Tuesday. You were not, at every hour, without choosing it, comparing yourself to the most beautiful, most successful, most apparently fulfilled version of every human being on the planet, simultaneously. That experience did not exist. It had never existed in human history. Researchers who study social behavior have consistently found that we are wired for close, repeated, face-to-face contact with a small number of people. Our nervous systems are calibrated for village-scale social life, not for processing the highlight reels of millions of strangers every day without end. That mismatch has a cost. The data tells us exactly how large, because something was about to arrive that would not just change how we communicate. It would quietly rebuild the entire structure of daily life from the inside out, and it would do it faster than any technology in human history. The year the line breaks, January the 9th, 2007, San Francisco. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and called what he was holding a revolutionary product. He was right, but the revolution went considerably further than he described that day. Within 5 years, half of American adults owned a smartphone. Within 8 years, 92% of U.S. teenagers did. The adoption rate was among the fastest of any technology in human history. And in those same years, here is what the data showed. Flat, flat, flat through 2009. Then, around 2011 to 2012, it begins climbing, and it never stops. Across the United States and comparable Western nations, including the UK, anxiety, depression, and loneliness in young people began rising sharply around 2010 to 2012. University counseling centers reported a 30% increase in visits between 2010 and 2015. Emergency room visits for teenage self-harm rose. Suicide rates in young women saw particularly steep increases. Now, I want to be careful here because this is genuinely contested territory. Some researchers argue that smartphones don't fully explain the rise. Economic inequality, academic pressure, the long shadow of the 2008 financial crash, those factors are real. No single cause explains a shift this large. But here is a finding that most people discussing this story have never heard. Researchers studied the mental health effects of Facebook's arrival on university campuses across America, campus by campus, year by year, as it rolled out. What they found was not just that Facebook was associated with worse mental health. They were able to calculate exactly how much damage it caused, measured against other known mental health events. Facebook's arrival on campus increased poor mental health indicators by an amount equivalent to approximately 22% of the mental health impact of losing your job. 22%. From a social network that most people thought was just a way to stay in touch with old friends. And this was Facebook, a slow text-based desktop platform accessed a few times a day. What happened when social media became fast, visual, mobile, and algorithmic, always in your pocket, impossible to put down, is what we are all living through now. But the phone itself is not the full explanation. What matters is what the phone made possible. 3 specific things happened to daily life, simultaneously, invisibly, over years, that together explain almost everything about what changed. 3 things that changed everything. 1. The comparison pool. Social comparison is not a modern problem. Humans have always measured themselves against the people around them. It is ancient. It is wired in. Part of how we assess our standing, our safety, our progress. But in the 1990s, the comparison pool was local. Dozens of real people, showing you their real lives, your colleague's actual car, your neighbor's real garden, your friend's actual house, with the washing up in the sink and the carpet that needed replacing. Real. Social media changed the comparison pool from dozens of real people to billions of curated performances. On any platform built on attention, you're not seeing what people's lives actually look like. You're seeing the best photograph from the best holiday, the most flattering angle, the most successful moment, filtered and edited because it represents the peak, not the average. In 1993, You compared yourself to perhaps 150 people you actually knew. Today, you compare yourself to the most successful, most beautiful, most apparently fulfilled version of several 100 million people, simultaneously, involuntarily, hundreds of times a day. You will always lose that comparison because you're measuring your ordinary Tuesday against someone else's best Saturday of the entire year. Researchers have consistently found that heavy social media use produces a distorted self-image, a persistent, low-level sense that everyone else is living a richer, more fulfilled life. But here is the part most articles about social media leave out. Heavy social media users don't just feel worse about themselves. They systematically overestimate how happy, how wealthy, and how socially connected their peers actually are. They don't just feel inferior. They build a fundamentally inaccurate model of what other people's lives are actually like. And they use that inaccurate model to measure their own real life against, every day, hundreds of times. That is not a small distortion. That is a false reality, constructed by an algorithm and believed completely. 2. The end of unreachability. The human nervous system evolved to respond to sudden stimuli as potential threats, a sharp sound, a sudden movement. Your body reacts before your mind has processed anything. This is the fight or flight response. It is ancient. It kept your ancestors alive. It was not designed to fire 80 times a day in response to a small glowing rectangle. Each notification triggers a small but real physiological response, a microdose of cortisol, the stress hormone. Each one interrupts focus. Each one signals below the level of conscious thought that something may require your attention. The result, accumulated over months and years, is a nervous system trained to be permanently alert, permanently waiting, permanently, slightly, on edge, without knowing why. People in their 40s and 50s understand something here that younger people simply cannot. You remember what the alternative felt like. You remember leaving work and work being over. You remember an evening that was genuinely yours. That unreachability, which felt like ordinary life, was also profound physiological recovery time. Your nervous system was allowed to actually rest. That recovery time is almost entirely gone. And here is the finding that makes that concrete. Workers who receive after-hours work emails show elevated cortisol, even when they don't open them. The mere expectation of availability is enough to prevent full recovery, even when you don't open it. The knowledge that it might arrive, the background awareness that you are reachable, keeps the nervous system partially activated. You cannot fully rest inside a life that is always potentially on call. For most people alive today, that is simply what life is. It was not what life was 25 years ago. 3. The lost hours. This is the one that surprises people most, because we have treated the elimination of boredom as an unambiguous good. But neuroscientists studying what is called the default mode network, the system that activates when the brain is at rest, have found something important. When your brain is not busy, it is not idle. It is processing emotional experiences, consolidating memories, generating new connections between ideas, rehearsing social scenarios, the difficult conversation you need to have, the thing you should have said differently, the relationship that needs attention. Building and maintaining the internal story that allows you to make sense of who you are. This is the brain's maintenance cycle, and it only runs when nothing else is demanding your attention. In the 1990s, this happened every single day, without effort, without intention. The walk to work without music, the lunch break without a phone, the commute with nothing but the window and your own thoughts. The mind wandered, and in that wandering, without you noticing, without it feeling like anything at all, it was working. We have eliminated almost every moment of that, every gap, every empty stretch, every bored minute, filled, instantly, automatically, without thinking, with a screen. And here is what that costs, measured. In a study at the University of Virginia, participants preferred giving themselves mild electric shocks over sitting alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes. They chose pain over quiet, not metaphorical pain, actual, measurable, physical discomfort, rather than sit, without a device, with nothing but their own mind. That is what a decade of constant stimulation produces. It makes the default state of human consciousness, the state every person lived in for almost all of history, feel genuinely unbearable. We called eliminating boredom progress. The data suggests it was a trade, and we made that trade without being asked what we lost and what remains. I want to be honest with you here, because the easy conclusion, phones are bad, put them down, go back to the 90s, is both partially true and completely useless as advice. We are not going back. The infrastructure of modern life runs through these devices: work, family, healthcare, banking, relationships maintained across distance that previous generations could never have sustained. There are genuine goods that came with this technology, real ones: connection across geography, access to information and opportunity that simply did not exist before, a voice for people who had none. But something has been lost that is worth naming clearly, not to mourn it, but to understand it. What is gone, probably permanently, is the social world bounded by geography, the involuntary, unplanned contact with actual neighbors, the evenings that were genuinely finished, the boredom that was doing something you didn't know it was doing. These were not choices. They were features of daily life, built in, structural, not optional, and they were dismantled by changes so large and fast that no one had time to ask what was being removed. There is a street not far from where you grew up, or one very like it. In 1993, on a warm evening, the children on that street were outside, playing, running, arguing about something that didn't matter, riding bikes in the half-dark until a parent's voice carried across the gardens, telling them dinner was ready. Nobody knew exactly where they were. Nobody needed to, because every child was outside, and the evening would end. The way evenings ended. Go to that street today. The question isn't whether today's children have more information. The question is whether they have more childhood. Some things, though, can still be reclaimed, not perfectly, not completely, but meaningfully. Boredom can be reclaimed deliberately. The walk without headphones, the meal without a screen, the 10 minutes of sitting that feel uncomfortable and are worth something precisely because of that discomfort. The brain's default mode network does not need hours, it needs minutes, but it needs some, and 0 is not enough. The comparison trap can be partially dismantled by conscious choices: what you follow, how long you scroll, and whether you remember, each time you feel that familiar quiet sting, that you are comparing your interior life to someone else's carefully curated exterior performance. And the end of unreachability can be reduced. The phone in another room, the notification turned off, the hour that belongs to you. It exists. You just have to take it back. People in the 1990s were not less anxious because life was better or simpler or easier. They were less anxious because the rhythms of their daily life, the limits of comparison, the spaces of genuine rest, the evenings that were actually over, were built differently. We built something new, without asking whether the old thing was doing something important. Now we know it was. This isn't a story about weak people in a difficult time. It's a story about conditions that no human nervous system at any point in history was ever designed to live inside. What you do with that knowledge is yours to decide. If this made you think differently about something you do every single day, that's the whole point. Subscribe. New video every week. I'll see you there.